I think we're ready to start our session. So hello again everyone. صباح الخير أو مساء الخير للكل. أهلا وسهلا فيكم اليوم. Bienvenue à tous et à toutes. Welcome to this latest session of the Plurilingual Lab speaker series. It's always a pleasure to gather really as a community as we continue to engage in these conversations that push the boundaries of language education, research, and practice. These talks are really always a great opportunity to exchange ideas, challenge perspectives, and connect with colleagues and experts in the field. So we have an exciting session ahead, so thank you all for joining us. أنا اسمي لانا زايتر وأنا طالبة دكتوراه بجامعة ماجيل الكندية. My name is Lana Zaiter, and I'm a PhD candidate in Educational Studies at McGill University, and I'm delighted to be your host for today's speaker series book launch of the Handbook of Plurilingual and Intercultural Language Learning. Before we really start with our session, I would like to start with a land acknowledgement. McGill University, which is actually Plurilingual Lab, which is affiliated with McGill University, is situated in Montreal, the traditional territory of the Kanien'kehá:ka people. We recognize and respect the Kanien'kehá:ka people as the traditional custodians of the lands and waters on which some of us gather today. I also invite each of you to reflect on and acknowledge the Indigenous lands in your own context. Today, we are incredibly fortunate to have the co-editors of the book with us. To start us off, I'll now turn it over to Dr. Angelica Galante, the director of the Plurilingual Lab, who will introduce our speakers in more detail.
Hello, everybody. It's very nice to see you again. It's a pleasure to be hosting this talk today with Christiane Fecke and Paula Garrett-Rutz, two of the co-editors of the Handbook of Plurilingual and Intercultural Language Learning, a book that has just been published, so it's hot off the press. Christiane Fecke is full professor at the University of Augsburg in Germany, chair of didactics of Romance languages and literatures, French, Spanish, and Italian. She published several manuals and handbooks, in addition to numerous publications about intercultural learning. Her current research interests are in plurilingual and pluricultural education, orientation towards competences and standard-based evaluation, teaching material, didactics of literature. Paula Garrett-Rutz, who's also here with us, is Associate Professor of Second Language Acquisition at Georgia State University in the College of Education and Human Development. She researches the formation of learners' cultural perceptions and stereotypes, social justice in language learning, and computer-assisted language learning. She is an ACTFL award-winning author and an international speaker on topics of intercultural competence and instructed language learning. She is editor of a U.S. regional journal, SCOLT Dimensions, and is an invited member on national and international editorial boards. So we are very, very happy that you have accepted our invitation to present your book. And now I'm going to be passing it on to Lana, who will share a little bit of the Zoom etiquette with us.
Thank you, Dr. Galante. So before I pass it on to our speakers, I would just like to go over some Zoom etiquette. During the talk, please keep your video and sound off. However, you may use the thumbs up and hands clapping features to react to our speakers' presentations and talks. The talk will be recorded and available on the Plurilingual Lab YouTube channel. So make sure to follow us on social media to know when the talk will be available. After the talk, we will have a 30-minute discussion. You can post your questions in the chat box or simply unmute your microphone to ask your question. The discussion will be moderated by Miguel Sanchez and will not be recorded. So without further ado, I will now turn it over to our speakers.
Well, thank you very much, everybody. I guess Paula and I were very happy just to be here today. And thank you, Angelica, for your invitation. Yes, we'd like to share the Handbook of Plurilingual and Intercultural Language Learning with you for this first book presentation. As you can see with the two symbols from University of Augsburg and Georgia State University, this is an international project. Yes, not only between Paula and me, but also with all our authors. And yes, Paula, you just may continue for a moment.
Okay, sorry about that. Hi, everybody. I'm Paula Garrett-Rux from Georgia State University. And as I shared before, meeting with all of you, being at McGill University is an honor for me as a speaker because it was growing up in Michigan. It was my high school dream to go to McGill University. And although I didn't make it to McGill, I made it to Europe and some other places. But it's an honor to be here at McGill. So the outline of our presentation that we're going to go over today, we're going to go through a brief introduction of key terms explained, and then we're going to go into what the language landscape looks like in Europe and what it looks like in the US, and a brief introduction to Asia, Australia from our third co-editor who is sleeping now in Australia and couldn't make it. So then we'll go into the handbook presentation, some of the book characteristics, the table of contents, and an overview of the sections. And if we have time, we'll talk about what we as editors from 3 different continents learned from each other throughout this process. And then we'll go with the conclusion of some of the book's objectives and then open it up to the questions and comments.
Right, and I would like just to share with you how we came together, because this is, as a project, a very interesting one. The beginning was that Wiley Blackwell sent me an email and asked me to do this handbook. And I was very surprised because I was thinking, how do they know me? I'm German. I only publish in German and they don't speak any German, that's for sure. But anyway, they did it. And I asked for first my former co-editor from a different handbook, Franz Josef Meissner, a famous researcher in Germany, and he joined the project. And then it was the 2 of us. But we're both German, and Wiley Blackwell said, no, that can't be. It has to be international. You have to find an author, an editor in the US and another one in Japan, preferably. Okay, as you can see, we failed with Japan. We couldn't find anybody in Japan. And anyway, this is quite difficult for 2 researchers from Germany, as we did not know anybody. And so we were researching on the internet people who would have published in the field. And so we asked one after the other. And in the end, Shusong Andy Gao, Chinese by origin and living in Australia, was one of the 2 that we found, and Paula Garrett-Rux in the US. And so we were very happy to get together. And I think for a year or so, Paula, we were working, the 4 of us. And then, unfortunately, Franz Josef Meissner passed away. And so then we were just the 3 of us. Okay, so this is a bit just to give you an idea how this works, how we came together. Paula, now it's up to you.
Thank you. Right. So, yes, the key terms. We'll start with multilingual and plurilingual because it's embarrassing to say when I was invited to this project, I thought it sounded interesting and I had never heard of plurilingual before. So thought, well, maybe I'll learn more about it. And certainly I did. So the 2 key terms that we're looking at is multilingual versus plurilingual. And multilingual is often, it's when you have complete languages written for a society, a place, or a space, whereas plurilingual is more of an individual or a person that has different combinations of different languages. And I really came to believe plurilingual is kind of like an adjective to translanguaging, which is a verb. So that's the linguistic part. And then for multilingual versus intercultural, I had been looking at that for a while, where multicultural is considered passive or a juxtaposition next to where cultures live next to each other. And I would consider an urban city that has different portions in it. Maybe it has Little Italy or Chinatown, how you have distinct groups without much contact with each other, perhaps, versus intercultural, which is where there's much more interaction. It's considered interactive because both people are learning and growing through these exchanges. Sorry, the timer on my mouse is not working well. So to situate our handbook in the field, which is one of the first parts of putting forth a book proposal, you probably, many of you see familiar authors here and familiar terms such as bilingual, intercultural, multilingual. But what set us apart was with the term plurilingual and the fact that ours is international.
Right. And so as it's international, and I've seen there is a really international public here today, I would like to show you a bit where I am coming from, linguistically, let's say. And in the next slides, I would like to show you a bit the linguistic landscape in Europe. And as you can see here, the languages in Europe, I guess many of you will be familiar with that. And for people like Paula from the US, this will look so different to what you can see in America or in the US. In Europe, there's more than 250 languages that you can find that are indigenous to Europe. The majority are Indo-European languages, and you can see in this in the colors what the dominant languages in Europe are, like Germanic languages, Slavic languages, and Romance languages. We have a population of 700 plus million people, out of which 94% are native speakers of an Indo-European language. Okay, I've just already mentioned the three largest language families. We have many other languages too. And these big language families have more than 200 million speakers each, which are 90% of all Europeans. Well, if you see this, you can also imagine that Europeans or people in Europe very often speak more than one language or more than two languages. So here is another statistics for you. So 2/3 of working age Europeans know a foreign language. And I find it always interesting to see how different this number can be realized in Europe, with countries like Luxembourg at the very top, where people speak 3 or more languages anyway, and everybody does that. And at the very bottom, you find a country like Hungary with 37% of the population speaking at least one foreign language. Traditionally, or very often, you find in these statistics Ireland and the UK at the very bottom or in the bottom part. According to which year it is, this can vary a bit. And well, this just goes by the fact that countries who have something like a lingua franca don't really feel the intention to learn many other languages. And if you see at the very top of the statistics, countries like Luxembourg, Lithuania, Latvia, Denmark, these are small countries with smaller speaker communities, with a different language policy, also different language prestige. And so this is why these things can vary in Europe. Paula, could you just pass me to the next slide? Yeah, and the language policy in Europe corresponds to this variety that you just could see on the first and second slide. And I would just like to go a little bit into the Council of Europe in the Common European Framework of Reference for Languages, which is one of the basic documents that we have in the last 20 years for everybody who has to do with languages. Well, it's from the Council of Europe, which is, since 1945, the oldest intergovernmental organization in Europe with 46 member states. This is not to be confused with the European Union. And its goal is upholding human rights, democracy, the rule of law, etc. They cannot make binding laws, but what they can do is something like the Common European Framework, which is exactly what it is. It's a framework of references. It's not a rule, it's not a law. And the basic logic that we can find here are the reference levels, the grading of individual language proficiency, the logic following the competencies, and the positive can-do descriptors that I guess most of you know very well. Next to this basic document, we have since 2020 the companion volume to the CFR, which is an extension to this first document, an update, if you can say, with a focus on mediation, on plurilingual and pluricultural competence, which was a term that you could already find in 2001, but which was not very prominent in this very first document. Okay, and now I would like to go to the next slide where you just can, no, the one before, right, where is again, this is just focusing on the difference between multi and pluri, with multi referring to society context and pluri referring to individual context. So a society can be multicultural or multilingual. That would mean not everybody in this society speaks all languages. And if you follow the term plurilingual or pluricultural, then you just always start from the logic of the individual. Right, and this is like the basic difference that we use in Europe. Okay, and now the next slide, which shows us, which is I find it's a nice graphic that shows us again the basic logic of the CFR and the companion volume. If you see in the very top, social-linguistic competence, pragmatic competence, and linguistic competence, these are the corners that we could already find in 2001. And now in the companion volume, we have this focus on plurilingual and pluricultural competence, and of course also on digital competence. It's all about mediation, reception, interaction, and production between two or more people in certain contexts. And the plurilingual and pluricultural competence plays a key role in this new document. Right, I think, yeah, and this is, I think, the last slide about foreign language learning in the EU. Maybe you also know that the Council of Europe in 2002 decided upon the Barcelona goal, which is a really nice idea, that every person in Europe should speak next to the first language 2 other languages. This is a nice goal. It's not realized completely, but and maybe it won't be. I don't really know. But in the statistics, you can also see how much it has been realized. At the moment, I'm sorry, I see many. Oh, okay, right. Something has changed. Now I can see my slide again.
And I apologize for that.
Yeah, there was, I don't know, it was gone. But
my personal messages popping up. It was, yes, the 2-screen system.
Okay, right. Right. But the big question is how many students learn 2 or more foreign languages? And this statistics, which is also from Eurostat, shows this is based from data from 2015, so quite old, but it always shows these things always shows you the variety that we can find in Europe. In my first slide, I showed you Luxembourg was at the very top. Greece or countries like that are at the very bottom. And this shows you how much this can vary in certain countries where there are 100 or more than 90% of people who are studying 2 languages or more in upper secondary education. And then there's the other end at the very bottom, Italy, Ireland, Portugal, the UK, yes, and Greece, who just don't really follow this logic. 10 years ago, the EU 28 was at 59%, right? So here we are. This is my background, where I'm coming from. And when Wiley asked me to do this handbook, so you can understand a bit, this is where I'm coming from, the logic I have in my head, and why I thought this is a good idea to do this handbook. Okay, we switch to another continent. Paula.
Great. Welcome to the United States, your neighbors to the south. So language diversity in the United States. Many of you are aware of it. We are English dominant in the United States. So some pictures that I put up, images I put up here is a representation of English spoken at home, so that you can see the areas where there is more diversity in languages spoken at home. Yet, as a nation, we have no official language. Official languages belong to the states. So The blue states here are the states where they have declared English as the official language. These 4 states have multiple languages, including indigenous languages that are spoken. And then these are the states with no official language. So, and I often think about the United States. I'm going to go back to this, how it compares to Europe. With the different countries that speak different languages working together versus us, where every state has its unique personality and its own linguistic law. So the language policy in the US, there's the history of bilingualism. Perhaps you've heard of America formerly being a melting pot, is what people called it, meaning that when you came, you shed your culture and language that you came with to melt into the US. Then it was in the 60s that people started questioning that and honoring more the language that people were bringing with them. And that is often political and changes with the times. However, what is more of my area of expertise is with foreign language learning in the United States. There is no national foreign language learning policy in the United States. Again, that is at the state level. And it's kind of ironic because many universities require only 2 years of language study before you go to college, or it'll be part of the application process, even though foreign language learning is not required or always promoted by the counselors. Another interesting thing I learned when I moved to Georgia was that early language learning in the United States in primary schools is not guaranteed. And it started when my kids went to school and they would come home, and we picked the area where we lived, knowing that they had a foreign language education program in elementary school, but they kept calling it a special. And I was like art and music and foreign language. And as a professional in the field, I would often ask, why is foreign language learning being grouped with art and music as a special? And I learned that there's not state funding or federal funding at the elementary school level where students would have more opportunity to learn fluidity in a language and pronunciation. Rather, in the States, you have property taxes for different school districts. So it's decided locally whether or not there's enough funding for a teacher to come in to teach foreign languages. So it's a special because it's not funded by the state, which is fascinating in its own, of the inequity between different school districts, which many of the chapters that I'll be talking about from the American context address. However, of the foreign languages that are studied here, you can see that we have Spanish is the predominant second language that's spoken. And Chinese with increasing amounts, and French, which is finally leveling off and remaining fairly constant. German is in there. And so similar to how Europe has SEFR, and the SEFR guideline we have, and the Council of Europe, we have the American Council on the Teaching of Foreign Languages, which has the national standards, which are, most states have their Department of Education bases the state standards on the national standards. We have accreditation that takes place with ACTFL at the national level, then at the state level. And then there is the National Council of State Supervisors for Languages. This is pronounced NACESFL, in case you were wondering what all those consonants together, how we made a word out of that. NACESFL. And so it is, and so basically most states, the way it works in the United States is you have a district coordinator, and then you have the district coordinators report to the state coordinators, and then the 50 state coordinators come together for this council. And they put together guidelines similar to SEFR, which it was wonderful to compare the two next to each other throughout this project. Of the NACESFL ACTFL can do statements of what learners should be able to do at different levels of proficiency. it was interesting to learn. It felt a little bit like the metric system, where all of the countries seem to use the European A1, A2, B1, B2, and then we have the United States where we reinvented the wheel, and where we go through novice, intermediate, advanced, superior. And the standards are based on the World Readiness Standards. It started in 1996, as the national standards for foreign language learning. 1999, they noticed cultures wasn't one of the standards and added it. There's been a couple revisions since, but 2015 was the biggest change, changing it from national standards for foreign language learning to the World Readiness Standards. So that's the European and American context. And I am representing Andy here in the corner, who, as a reminder, is in Australia and hopefully in the middle of the night there, sleeping well. But when he added an Asian perspective of education systems, in his areas, he focused on China more than Australia, saying that multilingualism is the reality that there are many different types of languages spoken, but monolingualism is seen as critical in sustaining national unity and the promotion of a standard language. While English is de facto the most influential foreign language, languages other than English, Lotte has been promoted as an effort to support the Chinese government's Belt and Road strategy. And as you can see, he has several publications on this issue as well. So the characteristics of our handbook, back to the book.
Right. Now we're just going to go to our handbook, and we would like to present to you what we have done and what the result is now. The task was to present the research field in a global perspective. And I found that a really interesting thing because before focusing on, let's say, my German limitations, I just expected other countries to be very, very different, to discussing the other, let's say, from a very different perspective or however it's going to go. So, as Wiley asked us to be international, we were looking for authors from all parts of the world. We found authors from 5 continents, from 21 different countries, and you can see here in the brown color, it's in alphabetical order. You can see which countries they are coming from. What we put here are what I put here are the countries where they're working, the universities where they are. But many of these authors are plurilingual, pluricultural in their biographies, and we could not really put everything there. So I just focused on the universities, where they're living, where they're working at the moment. So, but we can see North America is presented very well. So Paula did her homework. Yes, many authors from the US and Canada. We have a lot of authors from Europe. And the other continents, as you can see, were just not balanced in what we did in our authors. We have 4 authors from the huge Asian continent, 2 from the huge African continent, and 2 from Australia. So all our authors have a plurilingual and pluricultural backgrounds. Sorry, Paula, could you just shortly just go back, because I would like just to highlight something. We have this dominance of North America and Europe, which is due to certainly to the fact that Paula is in it and I'm in it. And of course, we know our areas best, and then we know people rather from this part of the world, and I don't know anybody in Peru, for example. That is one reason why we have this not total balance, but there's more reasons. Another reason is that according to the countries, people are presented on the internet or not. Because if you look for somebody in Turkey, well, we have to search in Turkey, Turkish homepages on the internet and so on. This is how this works. And certain countries, like France, for example, professors in France are not well presented on the internet. They just do their internet pages differently. And the Germans are very well presented, for example. That's another reason. And then a last thing I would like to say is I noticed that in the discourse of plurilingual and intercultural language learning, education, everything, there is still also a dominance of European and American discourses. So everybody is quoting Michael Byrom, for example. And I've never quoted anybody from Peru. So just to tell you, this is, I'm not too happy about that, but anyway, we did our best. So just to highlight to you what the logic is behind this slide. Okay, now Paula, you can go to the next one.
Great, thank you. So, the structure of the handbook?
Oh, that was me? Okay. Right, sorry. Right, this is the structure of the handbook as we developed it. And in this structure, you find a lot of work of Franz Josef Meissner, who passed away. In this first part of finding or establishing the structure, he was also still very dominant. So anyway, the structure of the handbook is a very, let's say, traditional one. We start with the fundamentals, with the theory of the basic logic of everything, and that is section 1. In a way, structured in 1A culture, 1B language, and then we did language policies because this would establish very well in our logic. Section B is dedicated to pedagogical concepts, and that means it just gets a little bit more practical in relation to language learning. And then again, section 3, even more practical learning and teaching approaches. And our section 4 is the shortest one, but we have it, is dedicated to diachronic aspects through time. So how did this develop through time? And we started in antiquity, by the way. Right. So that is the structure of our handbook. And I guess now we go more into the details, Paula, right?
Great. The meat of the book. So, in the first section, the fundamentals of intercultural and plurilingual language learning, we started with culture. And perhaps you can see some familiar names here with Ryoku Kubota, Michael Byron, Fred Dervin. But what was interesting is under the issue of culture, how nearly every author focused on diversity, equity, and inclusion, taking a critical approach to language learning. Considering power differences, and just a wonderful chapter by Ryoku Kubota, from multiculturalism to social justice, talking about from liberal education to a shift from liberal education to critical education. So that was looking at language aspects, or cultural aspects, excuse me, and then looking at language. Some chapters that I wanted to point out here were that I found particularly exciting were language comparison and plurilingual language learning and processing, which by Dr. Johannes Muller-Lancey, I apologize for my pronunciation of these names. He takes a neuroscience perspective of looking at plural language reception and production. And then for language policies, language and nation building, David Martinez Prieto has a fascinating approach using Mexico as an example, looking at language policies from Aztec times to contemporary times, and with, part of it becoming incorporated, I guess, appropriated, stolen by the United States. It's a great read. And I also wanted to approach Dr. Kelly Francis Davidson. It's a US perspective, but issues of equity and access in foreign language education. As I kept reading these incredible European chapters of how they're teaching plurilingualism in the classroom, I think this brings some balance of the issues that I brought up earlier of how access to language education depends a lot on property value. There's a lot of gates preventing people from getting access to language education in the US. And lastly, I wanted to bring to you Jason Sanoz and Dirk Gorder, the plurilingual language policies and teaching approaches in higher education, as they talk about English as the medium of instruction. These are some of my favorite chapters. Did you have any that you wanted to point out as well for this slide?
No, that's fine. It's okay. I just can continue with the next ones. I could just focus on Ulrike Jessner, for example, who is very much focusing on code switching and translanguaging. I think chapter number 9, translanguaging is a topic that we find in latest research all the time. And with this chapter, we are really up to date because they're dealing with their dynamic model of multilingualism that she developed herself. Right, that's me, Paula, I guess. Yes, that's me. Right. Okay, so we're just switching now to section 2, to the pedagogical concepts, which here is also divided into the pedagogical concept of intercultural learning and then of plurilingual learning. In the intercultural section, intercultural, I just find it develops into a term that is a very classic term in our field. I would like to highlight chapter 17, Transculturality, revisited already by Werner Delanoy from Austria, who is focusing on this topic of transculturality, of non-monolithic, non-static approach to culture with a postmodern frame, which is about culture mixing, hybridization, power-critical transculturalism, post-colonial positions, but he's also going further to cosmopolitanism, and global citizenship education. This is an interesting topic because he is approaching the topic in an attitude which goes beyond the classic term of culture. I would also like to highlight chapter 18, Assessing Intercultural Competence, which I found for years a very interesting topic. We were discussing this in Germany in the 90s and early 2000s. How about intercultural competence, how you can do it, and what to do and how to do it, etc. But then there was always this question, how can we assess it? Who is intercultural competent, who has reached the goal, who is there, let's say. And for years in the German-speaking discourse, we were always saying, you cannot assess that. Who is the good one and who's the bad one? No chance, we can't do it. And this chapter is dealing with assessing intercultural competence, with combining the possibilities of the ICC model of Michael Byram and also Bennett's model of intercultural sensitivity, and also the limitations of how to assess intercultural competence. And the last chapter I would like to highlight is chapter 22, Linguistic and Cultural Mediation. As mediation is such a prominent term in the field, we found Anthony Liddicoat and Martine de Rivry, who have a research project on mediation in the ILA Research Network. And so they're very prominent to develop and evaluate this term in this chapter. So far for me, Paula, now it's up to you.
And I have some shout outs for chapters. They're all wonderful, first of all, but the ones that struck me from my American context and training is I really enjoyed Christiane Falk.
Yeah, well, if you just use my first name, that's fully all right.
There's always a moment of pause with English. Also saying feel in French in the US context can be tricky. But so Christiane focuses on in this intercultural discourses between universalism and particularism, looking at the tension between these approaches. When you're identifying cultural differences that cannot be seen, it's hard to do that without looking at the hierarchies of the languages in power. And for universalism, identifying similarities, yet often ignoring the minority voices within cultures. So I think that brings up some great questions of power differences for critical approaches. I also pointed out, I found Manuela Wagner and Dominique Galvez, their chapter 21, Intercultural Learning in Secondary School Context and in Adult Education. And they refer frequently to the 2015 UN United Nations 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development is how they anchor the lens throughout that chapter and across different contexts and continents. I found that interesting. And of course, we would be remiss to not notice the wonderful chapter 24, by Angelica Gallant. Plurilingual and pluricultural competence, origins, current trends, and future directions. This would be a great place to start. If you're unsure about what plurilingualism means, pluriculturalism, it's fascinating to see the origins and how it has progressed, and of course, leading with future directions. And yeah, those were the main ones I wanted to point out. Okay, so for section 3, learning and teaching approaches, Christiane would always laugh at me because I was blown away with things that I think in European context, plurilingualism is considered quite normal. And I often forget to mention translanguaging because it's so common in my pedagogical training that people draw from different resources when they translanguage to negotiate meaning that I forget to mention. But plurilingualism, I really found this chapter, teaching intercomprehension and foreign language learning competence, so fascinating. Comprehension is just one of the 3 standards that we have for communication. There's, interpersonal, presentational, and interpretive. But intercomprehension, teaching the ability to understand someone without talking, not very American. So, and just seeing the different groupings that existed. There's, and how they're COM. They're called COM for communities. Help me if I get this wrong. Like the rom-com, the romance language communities, germ-com, the Germanic focused languages. And then there was Slav-com, the Slavic languages. And then really for me, seeing the tables of how to teach it. For example, I teach French, and I taught French in San Diego, California, next to the Mexican border. And after a year or 2 of teaching French, when I would have my Spanish speakers, I would just say, oh, like liberté, everything that ends in te ends in dad in Spanish. And I would just naturally start pointing out all of these similarities. So it was wonderful to see that there is a whole science, if I may, of the intercomprehension. I also really enjoyed Michaela Ruckel.
Michaela Rückel from Austria.
From Austria. In chapter 29, teaching and learning materials and fostering plurilingualism. What I really enjoyed about this chapter is all of the free links that she directs you to find. And where do you find these books to teach plurilingualism within the Romance languages, within the Germanic languages? She addresses those all. So I wanted to give her a shout out. Gosh, Andy, one of our co-authors, I hadn't mentioned much about his chapter in the beginning, but his focus on teacher education, preparing teachers, future teachers to deal with issues was wonderful. I also had noted here, this was an interesting topic. Doing language and gender in the classroom, teaching towards social justice, by Chris Nicely, who's an expert on this topic, which I think we see increasingly with younger learners demanding the use of pronouns, to not just assume that somebody carries a certain pronoun. It's a big issue in the United States, and as I meet people from Europe, across the world, but navigating that of, well, how is this chapter going to be received in an international community where there might be laws against addressing such issues? So we had great conversation over this. And in the end, I think Chris Knight, it's a wonderful contribution to the book, and particularly with the social justice lens. And Chris Nicely does a great job of explaining the issues with of how to be more inclusive with gender in foreign language teaching or world language teaching. And excuse me, that's one of the terms that we shift between in the United States. Many of us have a problem with the term foreign language because, as you saw in the slide, Spanish is the greatest foreign language that is taught in the United States. But we also know that we have a large majority minority of Spanish speakers. 30–40% of our population speaks Spanish. So to call Spanish a foreign language for me is not respecting, especially is not respectful, particularly given that we have no national policy, language policy. So I often use the term world language. Did you have anything you wanted to add to this, to the teaching and learning approaches, Christiane?
No, that's fine. That's okay. We can just continue. Yeah, right. Oh, maybe I just go back as you were, yeah, because you were focusing so much on chapter 28. I would just like to highlight that Interkomprehension, I just pronounce it in German, or teaching intercomprehension, is for 20 years a standard topic in Germany and in certain parts of the Roman-speaking world, because this all focuses on similarities between Romance languages. And if you just speak Portuguese, you can also understand Spanish and vice versa. And so this is really just a standard topic for us. As it was so new for you, for me, it was completely old. Okay, right. Thank you. And then, yeah, just maybe I go now to the next section, or our last section, the diachronic aspects, because we thought it would also be nice just to look back in time and to see how our topic developed in the past. So this is going back to antiquity to the present. Chapter 35 is going through the centuries. It's really going through the centuries and starts in antiquity and ends in the last century, I would say. Going through all the through different centuries, the rise of vernaculars, what happened in the Renaissance, what happened in early modern period with nationalisms, the 19th century, language standardization, and all these different topics. They are approached in this overview over several centuries by Simon Coffey. Chapter 36, I think, is also a very interesting chapter by Adelheid who is dealing with the development from the native speaker concept to the intercultural plurilingual speaker concept. Well, when I was young, it was clear I'm going to learn a foreign language and I want to reach the goal of a native speaker, the level of a native speaker. That's what I wanted to do. And that was the goal, the standard goal in Germany when you were at school. And so this idea of becoming a native speaker has been abandoned nowadays. And so it switched to the intercultural plurilingual speaker with this idea that it's not only about linguistic competences, but also about the intercultural dimensions in language learning, and plus plurilingual, more than one language, or more than 2 or 3 languages. And anyway, it's also about this idea that you don't have to be at C2 in every language you're learning. You can also have C2 in English, B1 in French, and A1 in, I don't know, Norwegian or so. Right, and so this is chapter 36, and we wanted to end in chapter 37, or with chapter 37, with a chapter that should be a kind of a summary of the handbook, and that should end with something which is positive. And this is a highly political chapter, critical applied language linguistic imaginings for a better world. Well, yes, we want to be all in a better world, and hopefully language can contribute to that, and intercultural dimensions too. So Gertrude Tinker-Sachs is just approaching this. She's presenting exemplary research projects, but in the end, she's pleading for an attitude of respect, of openness towards others, an attitude of equality. And I'm not so really sure. Maybe she's also adding a sentence like, we can't be perfect, but I'm not so really sure. But at least we wanted to end with something which has a positive idea towards a future and for a better world, even if it's just a drop on a hot stone.
Wonderful.
Right. So we've gone through now through the chapters, not through all chapters. Of course, you can't really do that. But at the end, the third part of our presentation, we would like to summarize a bit and show you what we learned, how we interacted, and so on.
Great. So first of all, meeting times. Throughout the 3 years that we collaborated, it was usually 8 a.m. in Eastern Standard Time in the US, 2 p.m. in the afternoon with Christiane, and 10 p.m. in Australia. Another thing is, just so you know, our dates, we all started after COVID, so was more natural to be talking virtually. In our interactions, I just apologized a lot for the United States. It had to be standardized in APA, and then for English, it had to be US English. So it was, when you read a lot about the hegemonic nature of English and you're from the US and you're writing authors in Europe, asking them to spell things differently, that happened a lot. The language use that it was in English between the authors, I kind of felt like a bridge sometimes because English is my native language. And of course, Christian's English is great. Andy, Zusong, his language is excellent, but sometimes it's hard to interconnect. So just repeating things sometimes that for clarity. And styles of communications between authors. We just, culturally, I study stereotypes, so I found it funny. We would have different strategies when there was something that needed to be spoken succinctly and direct. I'm like, Christian, how about you contact this author? And Andy was always very kind and flowery in his language. So we had different strategies for different authors. Things that we discovered, I learned that most of the world uses SEFR, the European proficiency levels. I teach French, I teach language learning, and so of course I'm familiar with SEFR and the language levels, but I didn't realize that, again, it's like the metric system where most of the world that we dealt with in our book, mind you, again, we didn't have a lot of African authors, but from the world that was represented, the majority use this. And discussions about minority groups was always a delicate topic between us as we discussed interactions with minorities and respecting minorities. It wasn't until the end, if you can believe this, year 3, that I saw Andy's name written down somewhere as Zusong. And he had an article that was X Gao. And I was just like, Andy, why is that? Why is it X and not A? And I didn't realize that he had been using an American or an English pronunciation with us. So that in itself, I believe, has a lot. Oh. Hello? And then the intercomprehension practices are just, I've lived it between Spanish, French with the rom-coms, and I just was wonderful. Many tears reading about European and Asian advanced language studies and policies, hearing, that it's the norm to learn 2 world languages, 2 foreign languages, and that, that's in addition to the language that you speak. But I was pretty aware of that. And then vacation times could be complicated between the 3 of us and what was considered traditional vacation times for university. Of course, Andy's in the Southern Hemisphere, so there was that. But even between universities, it was interesting learning about that. And I think probably the most salient conversation we had was about the term race. And we use, I think race affects the US due to our sordid history, and that it's hard to avoid the term race when you have an anti-racist philosophy. We all know that it's a concept, right? It's nothing more than ethnicity. It's a pigmentation. It's nothing more than that. But at the same time, when there's a history such as the United States has, it is something that needs to be addressed, and it's addressed by a lot of the US authors in anti-racist stance, whereas from Germany, I'll let you talk about that maybe, Christian?
Yes, I can do that. I think it's on the next slide as well.
I'll just
yes, it is here too. I start with the bottom bullet point, the use of the term race. That was really a very interesting and intense discussion of the 3 of us, because in German in German, you cannot use the word Rasse. This is an absolute taboo word. This is not to be discussed. Nobody is using that. And if you do, you're just a neo-Nazi, right? So that's when you use the term Rasse, because this term is so closely linked to the Nazi past of Germany, of the dictatorship in the 1930s and 40s in the Second World War, and Aryans and all this. So in German, you cannot use a term. It's absolutely impossible. I still knew that in English you can use, and you use, the term race. So, but editing a handbook with chapters in which the term race is used still causes a discussion between us. So how do we deal with this? And that was just an interesting thing. There is not really a solution to this, but it was an interesting learning effect between us, that in English you can use the term race and even ethnicity. In German, you never do it. No chance. And Andy in Australia was rather on the German side, because in Australia you don't use the word race either. We all use the word racism, and in German Rassismus. You can use that term. That's absolutely standard, but never the term race. And so that was very interesting to notice by creating this handbook with the authors, how different the approaches to the same field are according to which country you're coming from. That goes also for the term of languages, what Paula already mentioned. So I jumped to the very top bullet points. The terminology, foreign languages, world languages, and languages. When Paula the first time talked about world languages, my association was heritage languages. But that is again something different. Yeah. And so you see in Europe, this is in brown colors. What we use are terms like first language, second language, foreign language. And foreign language is a standard word for school languages. Languages that you learn in school are foreign languages. We also have heritage languages and migration languages. For Germany, if you just know a bit, that would be Turkish, for example. But we also have autochthonous minority languages. I hope I pronounce it correctly. So autochthonous minority languages are languages of minorities who live in a special country for centuries. So that is again a different topic to migration of people in the last century or so, or last decade. And and if you just jump to Switzerland at the very last line, school languages. The Swiss are a country who have 4 languages on their territory, so they cannot use the term foreign language, again, like what Paula said for the US. So they use the term school languages. Anyway, by using one or the other term, you just pronounce with this term a certain concept. And this concept that you have is based in your background, where you're coming from. And I found it very interesting to see how important the context is for the languages, the terminology you're using, and how different that can be. So in the end, academic discourses and research is also embedded in diverse social contexts. Right, so that is one topic here. The next one I just wanted to highlight was the thing with the prefixes. We also learned how different these prefixes are used, can be used, or how dominant they are according to which area you're in, whether it's multi, inter, trans, or pluri in relation to cultural and lingual. Right. And so here you can see a bit what we just learned throughout this project while we were doing it. There are many more topics that we could just maybe go into with your questions if you have some later. Oh, sorry, I'm just reading something there, but it was too fast for me. I'm sorry.
I'm sorry.
All right. Okay. So we just, I think that's our last slide, Paula, right?
Well, and then we just had the aims of the handbook.
All
and
right.
it's open for questions.
Okay. So here we are. Right. The aims of our handbook. Just to summarize it, we would like to contribute to the global visibility of research about plurilingual and intercultural language learning. That is just the general idea. And my idea is I would like to show the English-speaking world research discourses done in the non-English-speaking world. Because this is an interesting thing to see or to notice. If you're in a country who has a certain size, we all look to the countries that are bigger. And we don't look to the countries that are smaller. And that also goes for languages. So for myself, I'm coming from a country, okay, that's one of the bigger countries in Europe, but compared to the US, it's very small. So in Germany, everybody's looking to the English-speaking world. We check what the Americans are doing, what the Canadians are doing, everybody who's speaking English. We read English texts, but we don't read texts from Czechia or from Hungary. I don't know that. I have no idea about that. And I have the impression that if you're coming from a bigger language community, from the English-speaking world, you have the same logic. And you don't really look into German research because you don't speak German that much. So that's the logic behind it. So I had also this idea to show to the English-speaking world research that is done in the non-English-speaking world. And to promote the European language policy on plurilingualism. Right. We would also like to increase the sensibility of the interdependence between research discourses and national contexts, whether they're social, political, historical, linguistic, or anything else. The way we're thinking, the way we're doing research just depends on where we are and our backgrounds, whatever we have. And that's why we have to notice national characteristics of these research discourses, because it's not just the reality, it depends on where we are. Right, and at the end, I would also like to notice the global dominance of European and US American, maybe also Canadian research, and giving space to others, to all of those who are just not in the very dominant parts globally of this world. Right. Paula, would you like to add something?
I think it was achieved, Christiane. Having looked through every chapter in this book, it really, yes, I agree.
Okay, then do we have another slide? Something like thank
Just
you.
the end, and I think we're at our question, comments section of the presentation.
Yes, so probably it's time that I move on to the question part. So